Doug Wilson is a conservative, Reformed, and evangelical theologian pastor at Christ Church. After his stint in the submarine service in the United States Navy, he attended the University of Idaho, where he obtained an MA in philosophy. He is a faculty member of New St. Andrews College and a prolific author and speaker. Pastor Wilson is the publisher of and contributor to Credenda Agenda, a Reformed cultural and theological journal. He also blogs regularly at a blog called Blog and Ma Blog. He describes it as theology that bites back. He wrote Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning in 1991. His numerous other books cover a wide range of topics, but some are seminal on the topic of godly masculinity. These include, among others, Reforming Marriage in 1995, Federal Husband in 1999, Future Men, Raising Boys to Fight Giants in 2001, and Father Hunger, Why God Calls Men to Love and Lead Their Families in 2012. Doug also wrote Blackthorn Winter, set in 1705. With pirates and buried treasure, the book depicts the conflict of righteous behavior with foolish behavior, the outcome being a matter of life and death. So Doug Wilson has written and spoken about godly manhood as much as anyone else. And so it is with great pleasure that I welcome Pastor Wilson to this podcast.
But it's our two girls who do the podcast, What Have You. Do you know how many they have? No.
It's thousands a week.
I don't know, but it's so many women really enjoy it, and it is very casual. In the car, great, and with them dying laughing.
Getting wheezed up.
Wheezed and dying laughing. And it's just, anyway, it's good. People love it.
So they do it once a week?
When they are on, they do it once a week.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when they're... Our youngest just wrote a book called Yoo-Hoo, which is about identity for Christian women. Mm-hmm. I'll give you a copy. I know there's one here. But it's all this garbage about the year of the self and all that, where she is attacking that and laying out what Christian identity really is, who we are in Christ. It's excellent. She's been getting feedback like, you know, people can do Facebook Messenger now.
Right.
They can find you and this has totally changed my life. You know, it's really been a fruitful thing. She wasn't really prepared for and response. Then attacks. Hostility. And so, but she's doing great. I mean, she's making the most of it.
Wonderful. Praise the Lord.
Yeah.
And how old is she?
I do.
How old is she? Our kids are 38, 40,
I call it the
and 42.
podcast.
The podcast?
The podcast.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, he is a podcast.
Podcast, and it's.
He just does it by himself. He just talks about. He has a word study. He has something on the politics.
Each time,
or a
word study of Greek words for sins in the New Testament. A book review and some topic of the day, and I record four at a time once a month, and then Canon Press puts them out. So
he plods. He's a plotter. That's
So
kind
is
of
it
his thing. So it's called a
something
podcast.
you subscribe to?
yes, you can subscribe
It's
to
on his blog.
It's on iTunes and
It's
it's all the normal places, and it's just the podcast.
Okay.
Podcast, because I'm a plotter.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, he
It's got
is.
a big picture of a yak.
Yeah, there is.
So you were in theater.
No.
You weren't?
No.
In college?
No.
No,
I was
never
a
even.
philosophy major.
Not even
I
like
knew you were
a
a philosophy
whiff.
major, but I thought you, like on the side, you did some things in theater.
I was in a band. And
He was in a garage band that made a record, and he was writing for the paper a political column early on, but he never was in theater. That would be really fun. I'd love to see that.
So
Where'd that
I don't know
rumor
where
get started? Yeah.
somebody made that comment, and I had never heard that before.
Yeah.
No,
And I thought that was weird.
Yeah, it would be. It's very weird for me to imagine.
So tell me about your relationship with your father and how your childhood has led to.
Oh man.
So my dad he was the first generation Christian. My mom was the first generation Christian. So my mom became a Christian when she was 16. My dad became a Christian at the Naval Academy. And he went to the Korean War. My mom was a missionary in Japan, and he met her there in Japan. So after a tumultuous courtship, they got together, got married in Japan. And Dad was a zealous and very gifted evangelist. So he was an outspoken evangelical and evangelist in the Navy. Through a series of circumstances, they got out of the Navy when I was probably 4 or 5.
So were you born in Japan?
No, my sister was, but I was born in San Diego. There was the
While your dad was at sea.
Well, my dad was at sea when I was born. My dad was at sea when my brother Evan was born. He was at sea for 6 months of mom's pregnancy with Heather, who was born in Japan. And then Gordon was born after he was out of the Navy.
Where was he born?
He was born in Annapolis.
Oh, okay.
So are you the oldest boy?
I'm the oldest.
Yeah.
So, and free fun fact is when Gordon was born, Gordon is the youngest. He's 8 years younger than I am. When he was born, Mom was laid up and taking care of him. My dad went and did a conference in the Shenandoah Valley with his good friend Joseph Bailey. And that's where I met Tim. We were both 8 years old.
I didn't know it went back that far.
Well, I know that it was 8 because I'm 8 years older than Gordon, and Gordon was just born.
Yeah.
So it was a conference with, and I remember that Tim and I built a dam in a nearby creek with rocks. That was the, so.
That's like Shad's age.
Yeah, so my dad, after he got out of the Navy, So
how did your dad hook up with Joe Bailey?
He was.
Don't you think all the evangelicals knew each other back then?
Pretty
it was
much.
like they.
Evangelical.
Was he writing or?
My dad was kind of he wasn't writing yet, but he was the first Officers Christian Union, now Officers Christian Fellowship. My dad was the first staff member for that organization, and he was an academy graduate, and he moved in post-World War II evangelical circles.
Okay.
He was in a Bible study with Carl Henry at one time, and he was.
Of course, Corrie ten Boom was their friend.
Yeah, Corrie ten Boom was their friend. She
met them in Japan, I think.
Yeah, she accompanied them on the last half of their honeymoon.
Right. Because she knew Bessie. She wanted Bessie to be her traveling companion when she married Jim. So she just went, met him up during their honeymoon and visited them in Annapolis. And
so a lot of these names weren't huge. My dad dated
he knew
Ruth Bell Graham's sister once, and
he knew Lou Zamperini from the war. You know, the Unbroken.
Yes, right.
He just, I mean, it was just a.
It was a much smaller group.
Yeah.
And I don't know how he first met Joe Bailey, but Joe Bailey was in. He was the editor of Eternity, and he was one of the people in the Firmament. And my dad met up with him one time. So my dad would organize banquets
at the hospital when one of the boys died.
When Joseph Jr. died, it was a sledding accident.
Yep.
And so my dad was there at the hospital with them.
Where was that?
Philadelphia.
Okay.
So they go way back. Anyways, so when my dad got out of the Navy, we lived for a year in Tacoma Park, Maryland, and then moved to Annapolis. And my dad was wanting to run a literature ministry to midshipmen. And so he was an evangelist, organizer, spoke at, he was not a pastor at that time, but spoke at military conferences and whatnot.
Can I throw in one thing I learned since we've been living here? Is that when Jim got converted, he didn't know how Christians lived. He had no clue. Because he was super moral and super pleased with himself about his morality before he was saved, and he realized, you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So he started reading missionary biographies. Somebody gave it, and he thought, well, they'll know how to live like Christians. He's never moved on from missionary biographies. Wow. It's like, that is his bailiwick right there.
Right. So he tried to imitate, so he was a brand new Christian, and at the time, when I was a kid, there was nothing in print for Christians really on family or marriage or there was just nothing like that. And I think the first one was The Christian Family by Christians in the 70s. And so my folks were very diligent, conscientious. So, it's a big gift if the family just is intact. But if the family is intact and loving, and Dad's a masculine presence, and which Dad was, he's very much a leader and very much home. He would do things. They made a bunch of decisions early on, like he coached my softball team when I was a kid. He coached. He was involved, and so.
Well, when I was young, every father was.
Yeah.
I coached soccer for several years. I never met a parent,
Right?
Except the parents that were other coaches.
Yeah. Well,
let alone a father.
There are certain things that sort of went into the DNA of the family. One time, my dad was counseling a guy at our home I think it was on a Saturday or something, and my dad was counseling him in the living room, and they were talking, and I kept running in, interrupting with different things.
So you must have been 6, 5, 4.
Well, this was I was probably older than that.
Oh, okay.
But I was maybe junior high.
Okay.
But I was interrupting, and I would come in and ask, and finally I departed after one of these interruptions, and the guy he was counseling said, "Jim, can't you do something about that kid of yours?" And
Quit interrupting.
And my dad said, "Well, what you don't understand is he's a lot more important than you are."
And you're actually the interruption here.
So we knew growing up that, and it wasn't held over as like a threat or nothing like that. But my folks had very strict views about a minister's qualifications are in his family, because they were first generation Christians, and all they knew was what they read in the Bible, and they had this.
Imagine that.
And they had this commitment to, well, we'll just do what it says. And they said, if any of you kids depart from the Lord, I'm stepping down from the ministry that day. I'm not, because you're my qualifications for talking about this at all. And so it was not a threat. It was more security than anything else. So it was like my perception of things growing up was I could no more imagine not being Christian than I could imagine flying to the moon. It was not following the Lord was not an option, which is. So, I respect my dad more than anybody I know, and he's just a wonderful father.
So, were you educated classically, or how did you?
No, wasn't. I grew up through the government school system, but even that was a good thing, because this was in Annapolis, Maryland. I started going to school probably in '58, in late '50s, and Annapolis was at that time still a segregated city. So when I started going to Germantown Elementary, it was the white elementary school a couple miles away. And the black elementary school was just a block or two away. And I went to the white school. And when the desegregation order came down, there was a bunch of white flight and establishment of private academies, which I'm all about. I'm all about Christian schools, but the motives were mixed. And my folks didn't want to have anything to do with that, and probably couldn't afford a private academy anyway, because he was working for a Christian ministry. And so I grew up in the government schools all the way through, but I always knew that if there was ever a conflict between what I was learning at school and what my parents were teaching me, it was not even a question. I would just go with what my dad thought.
My experience has been that the Christian schools today, in the, let's say the last 20 years, that parents who are not teaching their kids at home send them to Christian schools.
Right.
And that the behavior in Christian schools is much worse than in government schools.
Yeah. I would say that's certainly the case in terms of behavior. Christian schools now and government schools of a generation ago, everything is slid.
Right.
Everything is slid. And I think it depends on whether it's an inner city school or upscale suburban school, you know, what it is. But yeah, it's pretty bad. The Christian schools can be pretty grim.
Yeah, I've spoken in some, and the respect I get in the government school is far superior. And by respect, I don't mean that I'm not talking about pride or ego.
No, it's
I'm
just
just talking about people not throwing spitballs.
the demeanor. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's ready. Bring your wine and we can refill it.
Okay, I think we're recording.
Yeah. So you grew up in a Christian home,
I did.
and you went to public schools,
I did.
and you graduated from University of Idaho. In
Right.
philosophy.
I did a stint in the Navy, so I
At
went in the
submarine?
service. So I did a basic, just under 4-year hitch in the Navy. Then I moved back to Moscow to go to the University of Idaho. I did my undergraduate in philosophy and my master's degree in philosophy then. And then a few years later, after we started Logos School for the kids to go to, we decided that we were going to teach Latin. So I went back to the U of I to learn Latin so I could teach it. And I had already had Greek, so then that just put me within a few classes of another degree in classical studies. So I went back and got a second BA in classical studies later. But that was all U of I.
So, and I know you've written extensively about this, and at some point I want you to say, where should someone who's interested in your thoughts about manhood, where should they start? Should they start with federal husband or with reforming marriage, or?
Okay, I would, if someone is not familiar with sort of the body of work, I would start with the book I wrote later, years later, called Father Hunger. So I wrote a book called Father Hunger that will be a good introduction, diagnosis of what I think is going wrong. So Father Hunger, then after that I would go to Reforming Marriage, Federal Husband, both of those are on marriage, and then Standing on the Promises is a book on child rearing. Okay. And then a recent book we just published last year, also on child rearing, more down in the weeds, practical, is a book called Why Children Matter. Mm. So that
would be the order.
That'd be the basic order I'd recommend. Yeah.
Great. So you've got in your congregation, you've got different kinds of men.
Yes.
Men who came from Christian homes and Christian schools, public schools,
right.
Non-Christian homes.
Right.
So what would you say to a 20-something-year-old man who has become aware of the idea of a biblical standard for masculinity?
Right. So the first thing I would encourage young men to realize is that although prerequisites in this are wonderful, if your great grandfather loved the Lord and your grandfather loved the Lord and your father loved the Lord and you've got a long legacy of this, it's not to be despised. Thank the Lord for it. But the instructions that Paul gives in Ephesians to husbands, he's giving those instructions to first generation Christians who 2 years ago were pagans, right? The same in Colossians. So all the New Testament instructions to fathers and husbands are instructions that are given to people who have fewer prerequisites than the average 20-year-old today or 22-year-old today. So God is kind to men who don't know anything and who are willing to say, yes, Lord, when he assigns them
He says, here's your post, here's your duty, this is what you're supposed to go do. If you say, yes, Lord, and you report for duty, you show 80% of this is showing up, right? Intact families, basically, you have to repent of believing all the feminist hooey and the egalitarian nonsense is being promulgated in our society, and recognize that men, as men, have a vital role and to play in the lives of their wives, in the lives of their children. Men are not optional. There's an old saying, old feminist saying, a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. And which they're saying basically men are superfluous, men are not necessary. And if you look at the rate of incarceration of boys who grow up in fatherless environs, if there's no dad in the home, what does that do to the incarceration rate of young men? Well, if dad's around, a boy learns what men are for. They find out what men are for, and they're much less likely to get involved in criminal activity. They're much less likely to get involved in drugs or other quick and rapid ways of destroying your life. Fathers are needed, and I hasten to add, this is not to say that mothers aren't needed. They certainly are, but that's not where we're bleeding out right now. In our culture today, it's a crisis of fatherlessness.
Okay, now put this young man in a marriage where the woman doesn't understand this.
Right.
Hasn't been taught it. She's a Christian, recent convert, not a recent convert, Christian home, I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
Her mother was in charge.
Right.
All the women she knows are in charge. Her girlfriends are all in charge of their marriages.
And miserable.
And miserable. No, right.
Yeah, they're miserable.
And miserable, right. And this young man now tries to do something, and all of a sudden a life that used to be fairly peaceful under the feminist matriarchy
Right.
suddenly becomes not so.
Suddenly becomes tumultuous.
Yes.
And so one of the ways we can tell how it's not just that feminists have feminized in their way the women, it's that feminists have feminized in their way everybody.
Yes.
All right. So we think that if there's a conflict, that's bad.
Yes.
We need peace at any price. We need peace now. We need to make a treaty so that never happens again. And a young man needs to be a vertebrate. He needs to have a backbone. And I don't mean that he needs to be a bully or someone who mistreats his wife or whatever. I think that's far more likely from invertebrates. So what happens is the men who capitulate, they're sinning against their own nature. They're not only sinning against the Word of God, but they're sinning against their own nature, and they're sinning against their wife's nature, and everybody's miserable.
Yes.
And then after a while, it gets to be too much, and somebody or both of them lose their tempers and do a bunch of damage that way, because that's sinful and destructive and selfish. If a man draws a firm line and says, this is what the Bible says my role is, I want to take my role seriously, and I want to defend that perimeter, there will be conflict at that perimeter, and that's not bad. It's not a bad thing to have to say this is what God's called me to do, and then defend what you said you believed. If every time we said, I want to obey the Lord, everybody around us said, oh, wonderful, and the Christian life of discipleship was accompanied to the background of polite golf applause.
Yes.
You know, what kind of discipleship is that, right? Who needs that? So a man needs to be prepared, not in a bullying, domineering, godless way, but in a masculine, sacrificial way. He needs to be prepared to lead his wife. And if she is taught poorly on relationship between the sexes in marriage, he needs to lead her in that area. So here's an example. A few years ago, my son was walking through a coffee house. My son Nate was walking through a coffee house here, and someone grabbed him and said, "Hey, we're having a bachelor party in the back here. Would you say a few words to the groom?" And I think Nate said something, "Sure, if you buy me a coffee, I'll do it." So he went back into the bachelor party, and it got everybody's attention. He said, "Here's my words to the groom. Never apologize to your wife." And then paused, dramatic effect. "Unless you actually did something wrong." Do not apologize. Do not apologize for the sake of making peace. Right? Don't tell. Because if you apologize for the sake of making peace, what you're saying is that I'm going to build my marriage on the solid foundation of lies. I'm going to have the basis of my harmony with my wife, the firm principle of lying to her all the time. Well, that is why and how men like that who seethe under that regime for 20 years up and run off with some Twinkie, right? And everybody at church says, "Where did that come from? It was such a mystery. It was such a grand mystery." Well, you can't build a good thing on a rotten foundation, and lying to your wife is a rotten foundation. Now, that doesn't mean the husband is right all the time or right about his own motives. There might be times where he doesn't apologize and he actually ought to. The issue is not whether he's a sinner. Of course he's a sinner. But if he goes in with the marching orders, when mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy, and he says, whatever it takes, I'm going to say, sorry. He is refusing to lead, and he's refusing to play the masculine role in that marriage, and he's refusing to be the father of the children who are watching all this.
Okay, so there's a survey by a psychologist. I think it's Harley is the name, and he wrote a book, His Needs, Her Needs. And you may be familiar with it. And he surveyed thousands of couples, and he came up with a list of the top needs as perceived by these people.
Right.
Probably not Christians,
Yeah.
just general population. Anyway, I want to give you 2 of the 5 for the husband and for the wife.
Okay.
And ask you, again, we're talking to this young man who has not seen this before.
Right.
He's listened to you, read you,
right,
and he's trying to do this, but because he's never seen it, he doesn't have the image to
right.
work with.
Okay.
Anyway, so we'll take the man first. Top needs: sex, peace.
Okay.
A peaceful home and sex.
Okay.
So,
run with that?
He has neither.
Correct. He has neither.
He has neither, especially because now he's trying to be a real man,
right,
and lead, and so he's having troubles with both of those.
Right. So, did you want to give me on the other side first, or should
I can, and then you can respond as you would like. For the woman, it's affection and communication and security.
Right.
And communication and affection are almost
right
the same thing.
Right.
And security is the other thing.
So the thing I would say about this is I think most people have generally a good idea of what the woman's needs are. Right. I think if you interviewed the general Christian population and you said, this survey says that women want communication and affection and security, nobody's going to say, look at my shocked face. Yeah. Everybody's going to say, yeah, duh, right? Everybody knows that, right? And on part of on sex and peace, I would say there's a fundamental thing that may have been part of the other 5, but it should have registered. It should be there because we want to hold everything we learn from psychology or our own observations up against the Word of God. So if the Word of God says that men need respect, what men need is respect. I would say that's the baseline foundational need.
That's on the 5 as well.
That's on the 5.
That's on the 5 is respect.
Okay, and I think presence or absence of respect is going to affect peace, sexual intimacy, and so forth. So I'm fond. This is part of when I do pre-marriage counseling for young couples. This is part of my shtick, part of the thing that you were unfortunate enough to put the nickel in here. So men run on diesel and women run on regular. It's two different kinds of automobiles. They run on different kinds of fuel. And so what happens is when a relationship's in trouble, we tend, and let's say the wife wants to work on it and the husband wants to work on it. We work on it by giving the other person what we would like to be getting.
Yes.
Right? Women want to work on a troubled relationship by loving their husband, showing affection, giving him what she would like to be getting and doesn't feel that she is getting. And men show respect. One of the ways men show respect is by giving someone distance. Right? So I'm just going to let you work on that. That's a way of I'm not going to interfere. I'm going to show respect. So the men give what they would like to be getting. Women give what they would like to be getting, and neither one of them is giving what God says to give. So the Bible says, husbands, love your wives, and no man ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it. And the word for cherish there is thalpo, meaning literally to keep warm. All right, so all the affection, security, husbands are told to love their wives. Wives are told to respect their husbands, honor your husbands. Look up to your husbands. And the New Testament never, ever commands wives to love their husbands. It's not prohibited. It's okay. It's not bad, not a sin. But and you can generalize. So the Bible says in Peter, respect all men, and that would include your wife. So a husband should respect his wife, of course, and love your neighbor as yourself. So a wife should. Or husband is your closest neighbor, so of course you should love him. But when the Bible says, husbands, you men, okay, fatheads, and it gives directions to the husbands to, focus. It says, love your wives, nourish, cherish. And when it speaks to wives as a class, it says, be submissive, honor, respect, okay? And men run on that fuel, and women run on that fuel. And you can't mix it up. That's how you get a stalled out car. That's why it just doesn't run. So men need to lead their wives in teaching them how to respect them. And men need to love their wives so that their wives are willing to be taught to understand that his needs are completely different. So when you talk to a group of women and you say that husbands are to love them unconditionally, they say, yeah, I get that totally, But if you say something like, well, wives are supposed to respect their husbands unconditionally, what is this madman trying to say? Well, but husbands think the same thing. If I just love my wife unconditionally, isn't she going to take advantage of that and walk all over me? Well, wives think the same thing. What if I game this out, and they don't need so. When the Lord Jesus tells Peter, feed my sheep, you can infer that that's the shepherd's duty to feed sheep. And you can also infer that that's the need of the sheep to be fed. So you can infer that shepherds need to feed and sheep need to be fed. So husbands, love your wives. You can infer that the command is given to our weakness. Men are no good at loving. Right? And women are no good at respecting. So the command is given to the respective weaknesses, and it's given to the respective needs of each person. So men are told to love their wives because they need to work on that. They're not good at it. And their wives need to be loved. And wives need to be told to respect their husbands because they're no good at it. And the husbands need respect as desperately, as deeply as the woman needs love. And when a woman, and respect has to do with abilities and achievements. So when a woman respects her husband and she thanks him for how he won the last war, or she thanks him for working so hard, or it has to do with abilities and achievements. Love has to do with the fact of the relationship, commitment to the relationship, the intimacy of the relationship. I'm here for you. So another way of illustrating this is if, let's say, this is a divine sense of humor thing. Men and women are completely different all the way through, all the way down in every respect. And it's like two completely different musical notes that if you hit them on pitch, it's harmonious. And if one's flat and one's sharp, there's nothing worse than there's nothing worse than a man singing flat and a woman singing sharp. But if they're on pitch, it's glorious, right? So one of the differences of men and women is men don't like to ask for help. Right? But they will. They can get to an impasse, and they can go down the hall at work and to talk to some coworker, and the problem could be a carburetor they're having trouble with, or a teenage son, or some difficulty with software or whatever. And when they open up to a friend, a guy friend at work, and they say, "Here's my problem. I'm having trouble solving this," the words they want to hear most are, "Have you tried this?" Because when the man asks for help, he is on the hunt for a solution. Okay? When a woman has trouble, she is on the hunt for a companion. Right? So he, poor dumb schlub, comes home. And he comes home, and she's had the day of days, and just all kinds of things are wrong. And she pours out her trouble there's this went wrong, and this went wrong, and this went wrong. And then he says, wanting to be helpful, "Have you tried?" and she says, "You're not listening. You're not listening." And he's thinking, "I thought it kind of was." But it's like two operating systems. It's Windows and Apple. They're functioning differently, looking for different things. And so a man is trying to be helpful, but he's not communicating his love successfully to her, which is why Peter tells us husbands should live with their wives with understanding. This is a subject that needs to be studied. You need to work it through and talk with your wife about it. And talking means going both ways. So husband needs to understand that his wife needs to be loved, and he needs to love her. And she needs to understand that her husband needs respect as much as she needs to be loved, and she needs to respect him. And if you do that, if you start doing that, it's amazing how potent it is. Because however badly all of us have been taught, or however poor however deep the ignorance goes because we weren't taught anything at all, these truths still resonate with all of us in our bones. This is how God made us. This is how God made men. This is how God made women.
What I've found is that these young men don't know how to speak romantically to their wives.
Right.
They barely know how to find a Hallmark greeting card,
right,
let alone compose one themselves.
Right. So I would say don't start with romantic talk. Start with civilized talk. Talk like a civilized human being, and then talk like a kind person. Right. Civilized first, kind second, loving, kind, loving, and then the details of when flowers are appropriate and when anniversary cards are, you don't give your wife an anniversary card on her birthday, and the nuances like that need to be worked out later. I would say women are generally overwhelmingly forgiving on the klutzy male side of things. If there's a commitment to treating you like if he's treating her like a human being, if he's treating her with kindness, if he's not hard to live with.
What do you mean? What's the difference between treating her in a civilized way versus in a kind way versus in a loving way?
Well, let's say you're. I've talked to couples before in a bad situation, and I say, look, you're having trouble getting along. You don't understand each other. Each of you thinks that the other one has it in for you. This is a bad situation. I can guarantee you it will not be helped by yelling. Right? So that's what I mean by civilized. Don't yell. Don't wave your arms. Don't do things that will get somebody to call the cops. That's what I mean by civilized. Now, you can reel it in and be civilized and still think that the other person has got it in for you or whatever. And you're not thinking kindly, you're not believing the best. But still, don't make it worse. This is one of my, I say this often pastorally. I say, don't worry to the people I'm talking to. Don't marry. No situation is so bad, but that you can't make it worse. The pastor said encouragingly. And so don't make it worse. And then we can have a little period of calm, civilized calm, where we can work on what love looks like and what thoughtfulness, what respect looks like, and et cetera.
So how about some examples of a husband being kind to his wife?
Okay, it says in Ephesians 5 that the husband has two models. One is Christ in the church. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And husbands, love your wives as your own bodies. Yep. Okay, so, and those are two very high thresholds. Christ's love for the church is enormous, and a man's love for his own body is enormous. And so what kindness would look like is him taking, what Paul's doing there is saying the golden rule applies to marriage. If you've got a roaring headache and you've had all sorts of things going on all day, that's your template. That's your baseline for how you would treat your wife if you come home from work and find out that she's had a roaring headache and had quite the day. You know what you would like under those circumstances. You would not like you've got a roaring headache. You don't want to go to a rock concert. You don't want to, honey, let's drop our plans. We were going to go out, we were going to do this thing, but let's put you first. And then not have an undercurrent of resentment after the fact for having look what I gave up for you. That's an example, a tangible example of kindness.
What are your thoughts about husbands dating their wives? I had a very respectable Christian man recently
right?
Object to my encouragement on the podcast that men date their wives. And he said, but dating's not in the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah, and I say, neither is your unhappy marriage in the Bible. One time I was talking to a counselor, a married couple, and out of the blue, I forget what made me ask this, but I said to the man, I said, are you the kind of person who gets bad service in every restaurant you go to? And I saw the wife smile, bad service. Well, what's the constant? What's the variable? The restaurants are all the variable. Who's the constant? He's the constant, and that's how you talk about this. Sure, dating's not in the Bible, or family night's not in the Bible, right? But love your wife is in the Bible. Live with her with understanding is in the Bible. Understanding her involves talking to her. You can't talk to her if the chaos of life, 3 teenagers and stuff. So if you go out on regular dates, I do want to push back against. I don't think a man should date his wife as though he can somehow pretend that he hasn't won her. Right? It should be a husband and wife on a date, not boyfriend girlfriend on a date. But I absolutely believe that a husband and wife need to get away. And sometimes it's a getaway and they just go out to a nice restaurant and they talk about family business. Other times they get away and it's an anniversary date and it's more romantic. But and both are great, both are fine. But I don't think if someone says it's not biblical because dating is not a biblical word, I say, well, biblical is not a biblical word either.
Okay. Talk to single men about winning a girl.
Okay. So, my dad has a saying that he's counseled people for many years, and he says, if you're single, if you're a young man and you're 27 and not married, he said, find out her name and ask. if you're 27 and not married, then you're burning daylight, man. And unless you're the Apostle Paul, I need to fight against a bunch of things here. I do believe there is a gift of celibacy that where people have the gift that the Apostle Paul had, and I think that that's a very rare gift. There is no such thing as the gift of singleness. Singleness is not a gift. If you're not gifted with celibacy, then singleness is an affliction. And it's an affliction that you ought to be in the joy of the Lord, and you ought to walk with God, and you ought to be giving it to God like you would any other affliction. But if you lost your leg in a car accident, that would be an affliction. You should rejoice always. You should thank the Lord always and for everything, giving thanks. You should give thanks for the affliction. You should rejoice in the affliction. You shouldn't pretend that it's not an affliction. Okay? So if you're single and you're not gifted with celibacy, then you really need to get on the stick. And I would say that men should move that the priority of getting married should be moved to the top of their priority list. And in our day, when I got married, and this is just one generation, I got married in 1975. When I got married, I was right in the pack. I got married when I was 22. Nancy was 23. Now the average age of getting married is like 27, 28. People are postponing marriage. And the reason they're postponing marriage is because there are a whole host of reasons, demographic reasons. And unfortunately, Christians are following the world in this. But I think the prevalence of pornography, the prevalence of easy sex apart from marriage has been it used to be half a century ago, men who were industrious, hardworking, and highly sexed lived in a world where that wasn't going anywhere unless they got married. And so they got married early, which was a great civilizing influence. I believe that sexual energy is like hydraulics. If you can, in a hydraulic system, you can, in a big earth-moving equipment, you've got all this hydraulic fluid that's under pressure, and it runs in fixed channels, and you can move mountains that way. That's what builds civilizations. If you have a big sexual puddle or a big sexual swamp, you can't build anything. It's just this big morass of self-indulgence. So I believe that when women hold out, if they refuse sex, not without a ring, when that standard is held and men are taught to be ambitious and to go places, they marry early. And basically, I think that's the foundational to all to civilization. If I could use another example of this, and there are qualifications I want to make with all this, but basically the two different approaches are when male sexuality is subordinated to female sexuality, and when female sexuality is subordinated to male sexuality. If you compare those two things. So the male sexual cycle is from arousal to climax. The woman's sexual cycle is from arousal to when the kid graduates from college. Okay. And her sexual cycle involves curtains and a mortgage and a white picket fence and a lawn to mow, and it's a way more complicated thing. So when a man subordinates his sexual cycle to hers, the first thing that happens is a middle class. The first thing that happens is houses. The first things that happens is stable homes. If it goes the other way, and women are talked into subordinating their sexual cycle to the man's, what you get is a boatload of Vikings. All the civilization building power of a motorcycle gang, right? Because it's short-term thinking. There's no long-term thinking. Women are God has built it into them to be long-term thinkers, and men are by nature short-term thinkers, but are at their best when they become long-term thinkers, which means that they're at their best when they're with a woman for life.
Yeah. So back to the subject of winning.
Yes, winning a woman.
Right. In our culture, a lot of the aggression and initiative is female.
Right.
and men are not, they're not initiating a relationship.
Right.
Or if the relationship happens, they're just sort of a morass rather than leadership,
Right.
rather than actually winning her heart by appealing to her in a way that makes her want to be with him.
Right.
So that's what I mean by winning. I thought that's what you meant by winning.
Yeah, that's
And
what
so-
I would mean the same thing by winning. Yes.
So real basic, somebody who wants to win, how does he do that? What's
So-
involved with winning?
I would say for a man who wants to win a woman's hand, wants to win a woman's heart, her affection over a lifetime, he needs to be committed to the idea of keeping score. Right? If he grows up in a Parks and Recs program where all we do is run around the bases and everybody's a winner here, everybody's a participant here. I mean, we're up against propaganda from the devil in every aspect of our lives. And young men don't know how to be ambitious. They don't know how to be hungry for something. And a wonderful book, if I could recommend this book, it's Rescuing Ambition by Dave Harvey. And he shows, and I think this is all over the New Testament, men are built by God to be glory seekers. We are disobedient if we're not seeking glory. So the difference between a good man and a bad man is not that the bad man seeks glory and the good man doesn't seek glory. That's Taoism, or Stoicism. The good man, in scriptural terms, is the man who seeks glory the way God says, and the bad man is the man who seeks vainglory. So it's pursuing glory rightly and pursuing glory wrongly. In fact, Paul even defines sin in Romans as falling short of the glory of God. So it's if a man says, "Oh, I just want to," if he flatters himself that he's being humble because he's still in mom's basement playing video games, that's not humble. Right? That's not humble. So he needs to, before he wins a girl, he needs to practice winning at anything. So we all know that there's a problem with excessive competitiveness, and there are men who are jerks in competition, etc. But our great deficiency culturally right now is the apathy when it comes to competition, or the apathy when it comes to getting ahead, or the apathy. So if a man wants to win a woman, he should win a job first, right? As I never tire of telling young men, women are very, very, very expensive. And you're going to need to have a work ethic. You need to have a job. You need to channel when you are going through school, I'll tell college students, what's the job in front of you? Excel where you are, hit it. Another way I have of saying this to young men, this is what I would say is the key ingredient to winning a woman, is I tell young men is become the kind of man that the kind of woman you would want to marry would want to marry. So sketch for me what kind of woman that is. What is she? And if he says, well, beauty pageant winner, Rhodes Scholar, heiress, and then I say, okay, fine. Are you becoming the kind of man that kind of woman would be attracted to? Why? One time, this was one time I was counseling a young man who was interested in a young woman, and the young woman his fancy had lit on was a very, very godly, attractive young woman, and so he had impeccable taste, and he came in to talk to me about it, and he gave me all the reasons why she would be a blessing to him, everything. She's this way, this way, this way, this way, and everything he said was right, and I said, okay, great. Now tell me all the ways that you would be good for her. How would you be a blessing to her? And it was like someone had hit him in the forehead with a baseball bat. It was like, that had never occurred to him. You mean I've got to be a blessing to her? Yeah, he knew what she could do for him, but ambition on winning a woman is being meticulously critical of your own achievements, what you're doing, how you're going, being brutally honest with yourself. Do you work hard enough? Do you get up early enough? Do you have a work ethic like your great grandfather did? You know what? That sort of thing is, I think, experience in sports is invaluable. Experience in taking your studies seriously is invaluable. Experience in working hard when you're still single and can afford to spend time at the office and not be ripping anybody off by doing that. Those are all the ways that you develop a winner's attitude. And when it comes time to court a woman, you know what you're doing. It's the same. You're doing the same thing.
Great. There's some incompatibility between the male sex drive and the female sex drive
This is true.
that I'm told has led to some frustration on both parts.
Yes. This is another divine sense of humor thing. God thinks things are funny that we don't think are funny. So male sex drive peaks at something like age 19, and the woman's peaks at something like 30 years old or something. And you say, whose idea? Whose idea was this? And so what you had, everything about marriage is meet in the middle. Everything about marriage. So it's compromise, understand one another, maintain your sense of humor, and meet in the middle. So if the marriage is characterized by kindness and forbearance and forgiveness, and you understand that men and women are completely different, sexually as well as every other way, then you're going to meet in the middle. So there will be times when the man is giving to the woman when he doesn't feel like it. Let's say if they're having trying to get pregnant, or there's all sorts of things where he's serving her, giving himself away. There will be other times when she's doing the same thing, and we ought not to begrudge the gift, ought not to begrudge the mutual giving. This is a design feature. This is a feature, not a bug, and so we should just take it that way. And if you are kind to one another, these are things you can work out.
So the man is to lead his wife.
Yes.
And let's say she's frigid.
Okay. Well, let's say...
The only reason I say this is, as an elder,
right,
as one who knows couples, I would say the frequency of this is greater.
Okay, yes, it happens, right?
I
So
think it's happening more often.
I think it's happening more often. And so if I have a presenting situation like that, and it's outside the normal tolerances, one of the things I would have at least 2 or 3 lights on my pastoral dashboard blinking. I'd say frigid is kind of a catch-all sort of thing. The first thing I would ask is, all right, did anything happen to her? What's her story? What's her story? Abusive boyfriends? Creepy uncle? Father molester? What happens? So if everything appears to be normal and he's a nice guy and she says, oh, he's a wonderful husband, he's thoughtful, and I just don't know why I have these panic attacks, or I don't know what the deal is, the first thing I would do is start asking questions about, tell me how you grew up, tell me your background, were you ever molested, were you ever ripped off sexually, do you have sometimes she was a willing participant in sexual misbehavior earlier, and the issue is guilt. Sometimes it's that she feels defiled. It was done to her, but she still feels defiled. So there that way. Another blinking light on the dashboard is he might be a swell guy at church, but way more of a jerk at home than he comes across as at church. And so he says, well, I just have a normal sex drive, and she's cool and rejects my advances. Well, I say, well, how many fights have you had this week? And if it's 3, then this is not, we don't have a big mystery here, Sherlock. But if you check all those things and there's no history, no history that she has, no history that he has that was off-putting. Let's say, well, he told me right before we got married about his long history with porn, and I just can't get over it. Or it could be his history, it could be her history, it could be his the way he's coming across at home. He might be being a jerk, that sort of thing. If it's nothing like that, then I would say what's probably necessary is an in-depth Bible study with the couple on what God teaches about sex and sexual relations, because there may be false doctrine involved where it wasn't molestation or guilt or anything like that, but a really prudish grandma who taught Sunday school, and and it says that in the Song of Solomon, or it says that this is in the Bible. Are you serious? So it's a simple matter of discipleship. So here, you're not in any bizarre external circumstance, and so that means you just need to submit your emotions and your responses and your attitudes to what the Bible teaches.
Terrific.
Thanks.
Could you tell me, we're getting better recording now.
Okay.
Could you tell me about your upbringing with your father,
Sure.
your childhood, the
Yeah.
things that we have spoken about?
Yeah. I would say that I was exceedingly blessed in the family that I was given when I grew up. My mom and dad both knew the Lord. They were both first-generation Christians. My mom was converted when she was 16 at a revival meeting in Alberta, Canada. My dad was converted while a midshipman at the Naval Academy. So they were both converted later on, and neither of them had a Christian upbringing. My dad was privileged to lead his brothers and his mom and dad to the Lord, and so it was retroactively a Christian home, but not the home he grew up in. And my mom, her mom had died when she was 4, and it was kind of a scattered, discombobulated home and not a Christian one. And so she was converted at 16, wound up becoming a missionary to Japan after the war, and met my father there when he was a naval officer in the Korean War. So my folks got married in 1952 in Japan, and so when they got married in 52, they started having kids. I was born in San Diego. My brother was born in Monterey, I think, and my sister was born in Japan. They were back and forth. So Navy family for the first 5 years or so of my life. And then my dad got out of the Navy to do full-time Christian work, and we moved to Annapolis, Maryland. I'm collapsing some things, jumping over some things. But Annapolis is my hometown. I grew up there. So my mom and dad were diligent, conscientious Christians. They lived what they taught, basically. They taught Christian, basic Christian truth to others evangelistically, and they lived that way in the home. So I've told people, when I went off to the Navy, when I went in the Navy, I left when I was 18, and from the time, as far early as I can remember to the time I left, I never heard my parents raise their voices to each other, ever. And I simply didn't have a category in my head for that. And they just didn't. They just got along. And it wasn't that they never had issues. They had issues and they had things to work out. They just didn't do their laundry on the front porch. They would take care of it privately. And I learned from my father the importance of what he calls short accounts. If you sin, pick it up now. Deal with it now. Don't let it fester. Don't let it lie there. So, and my parents practiced that. So I grew up in a very happy, well-adjusted home. My dad was there. He was present. He was very busy with ministry, but he was committed to spending time with us. He coached our teams. He coached my softball team. He coached my basketball team when I was a little kid. He was very involved that way. And so even though I went to public school all the way through, I whenever there was any conflict between what they were teaching at school and what I knew my parents believed, I always just default went with my parents. It was just, it was unthinkable to go any other way. I can't imagine. Basically, we were brought up in a way, it's not that we knew that leaving the faith would be wrong. It's that we felt like leaving the faith was unthinkable. It was like trying to square the circle. How could we? How could we do that? And it was just not a category. So I can't calculate all the things I learned from my dad, the things I learned from him directly, and the things I learned from how he would read to us all the time growing up. It was a bookish family, so he would read Narnia stories to us. In fact, we started the first Narnia story when I was 5, which would have been 1958. I think they were still coming out, so the Narnia stories were still like a new thing. We were a reading family, a read aloud family, and he just spent a lot of time with us. And so I learned directly from him, and I learned indirectly from him in all the things he was reading to us.
So would you attribute your ability to persuade and your rational approach to the reading, to your father?
I would say the love of words and the love of communicating to people, I would say I got first from my dad. And then I would say I was introduced to C.S. Lewis early on, and it was from Lewis that I learned detailed argumentation. So I started reading Lewis's apologetic works when I was in high school, and I just gravitated to that kind of thing. But I think I loved Lewis because of the prep work that had been done by my family.
My father has used with me a couple of words. I think they're fairly classical virtues. Charity and thrift are important, but diligence, but prudence and fortitude. Mm-hmm. And I've used that with my sons,
right,
especially, and have realized that when I exhort them to be wise, especially in difficult circumstances, mm-hmm. and to be courageous, especially in dangerous circumstances,
right.
and that they need to do both of them.
Right.
You can't have fortitude without prudence, or prudence without fortitude. Again, this comes from my father, but he demonstrated that to me.
Yeah, I would say
you have prudence and fortitude.
Well,
you have attacked some of the giant evils in our culture. So tell us about that, about where that comes from. And
I would say quickly on the prudence and fortitude, I like that matchup because teaching your sons to have prudence, it's good for your wife to hear you teaching them that, because boys need to fall out of trees. Let's be, it's good for their souls. So boys need to fall out of trees, but they need to be prudent and not to fall out of the very top of a 50 footer. They need to be prudent, and they need to have fortitude, after the fact. And so I think that's a great pairing. My dad taught me that we should have no problem passages. So if the Bible teaches it, then that's the way it is. And a Christian should be the kind of person. A Christian man should be the kind of person who's willing to charge hell with a bucket of water. Mm-hmm. And if that's the will of God, then this is what we should do. And I remember my dad when I was in junior high, my dad started a junior high Bible study. There was about 20 kids in it, and we'd run around for an hour, and then we'd have a Bible study. My dad taught us inductive Bible study methods. And I remember vividly, this is maybe one time, he asked a question. He would ask a question, the answer was in the text. So we were all sitting there with our Bibles open. My dad asked a question, and we were all staring at him. And he said, "The answer's not on my forehead." The answer's in the book, back in the book. And if the book teaches it, if you're certain that the book teaches it, the word teaches it, then it's hell or high water. That's what it teaches. And that was something I learned from my dad. And there was I won't go into the details of it, but when I was in high school, my dad was working for a big Christian organization that was starting to go south, starting to wobble on doctrinal issues, and my dad appealed the decision that they made all the way up to the head, and the decision went against him, and so he resigned his position, and as a matter of conscience. And we were sort of high centered there, and I grew up in Annapolis, but we were there in Ann Arbor, Michigan for high centered. He was there without a job. What are we going to do? But he took principled stands, whether or not it looked like there was a safe landing spot. Sorry, that's something I learned from my dad.
But you've done it. You are doing it. And there are too few men who are stepping up to the plate to do it.
Right. And I've wanted to do it in such a way that my son and my sons-in-law are with me. So when the Psalms speaks about the blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them, it's children are a blessing, and little toddlers are a blessing. But it's not talking about the patter of little feet around the house. The blessing is having sons who stand with you when you're contending with your enemies in the gate.
Yes.
And so you're at the city council meeting, right? You're at the city council meeting, and your son's there, and your sons are on your side, and they're behind you. And so I learned that from my dad. So he was in the fray. I wanted to be a force multiplier for him. That means so he's doing this. I wanted to be a force multiplier for him, and I've got 2 sons-in-law and a son and grandsons coming up online who are force multipliers for me. So that's courage is contagious.
I love the prayer in Ephesians 1. We actually used it this morning. Mm-hmm. That's one of my prayers for my sons and my son-in-law, and for all young men in the church today, mm-hmm. that we would have wisdom to know. I think there's 3 things. Yeah. What are they? The surpassing greatness of his power,
right?
The riches of his inheritance, mm-hmm. and there's a third one.
Yeah. And then there's another one in chapter 3 where basically Paul says, I pray that you'd be able to grasp the ungraspable, yeah. and know the unknowable, yeah. and to be filled with all the fullness of, yeah. God. Yeah.
But to know the surpassing greatness of his power,
right,
I think gives us the fortitude,
right,
and to know the riches of his inheritance in the saints,
right,
that it's not apart from the saints,
right,
that we fight.
It's in the church, yeah.
We fight in the church and for the church, mm-hmm. not just for ourselves.
Amen.
You seem to embody these things, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, but thank the Lord. Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure. I hope we could maybe do this again.
Thank you for listening to the Basic Training Podcast, taught by Dr. Robert Forney. This podcast is available on Spotify and the Google and Apple Podcast apps, also on the Basic Training YouTube channel. If you want to contact us with any comments or questions, please email basictrainingpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and God bless.